Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper, where forgotten civilizations, unexplained wonders, and ancient secrets come back to life. Ready to unravel the mystery? Let's begin the journey. Friday the 13th. For millions of people, these words evoke a sense of unease, a feeling that something bad is about to happen. It's the most famous superstition in the Western world. But where did it come from? The answer may not lie in simple bad luck, but in a real historical event. A day of betrayal, torture, and a curse uttered by a dying Grand Master. Friday the 13th. There are few combinations of a day and a date that evoke such an immediate and visceral reaction in Western culture. For millions of people, it is a day marked by a vague, creeping sense of anxiety, a day to be approached with a little extra caution. People might avoid making important decisions, postpone travel plans, or even refuse to leave their homes, all because of a feeling that the day itself is somehow tainted with bad luck. This fear is so pervasive that it has a clinical name: paraskevidekatriophobia. Economists have even estimated that businesses suffer significant losses on Friday, the 13th, due to people avoiding commercial activities like shopping or flying. It is, without a doubt, the most famous and widespread superstition in the modern Western world. But where did this powerful and peculiar fear come from? To understand the anatomy of this modern superstition, we must first realize that it is not a single ancient belief. It is a modern hybrid, a cultural construct created by the fusion of two separate and much older streams of fear: a deep-seated suspicion of the number 13, and an ancient stigma attached to Friday. Let's begin with the number itself. The fear of the number 13, known as triskaidekaphobia, is a remarkably persistent and widespread superstition with roots that stretch deep into ancient history and mythology. Long before it was ever associated with a specific day of the week, the number 13 was seen as an intruder, a disruptive force that upset balance and harmony. Many ancient cultures based their systems of counting and measurement on the number 12. There are 12 months in a year, 12 hours on a clock face, 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 gods of Olympus, and 12 disciples of Jesus. The number 12 represents a sense of completeness, of cosmic order and perfection. It is a number that is neat, divisible, and whole. In this context, the number 13 becomes the unwelcome guest. It is the number that comes after 12, breaking the sense of completion. It is a prime number, indivisible and awkward, a symbol of disorder and bad fortune. This abstract sense of unease found its most powerful and enduring narrative within Christian tradition. The foundational story for the unluckiness of 13 is the account of the Last Supper. On the night before his crucifixion, Jesus sat down for a final meal with his 12 apostles. In total, there were 13 individuals gathered at that fateful table. The 13th guest to arrive, according to some traditions, or simply the 13th member of the party, was Judas Iscariot, disciple who would betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, setting in motion the events that would lead to his arrest, torture, and death. In this powerful story, the number 13 is forever linked with betrayal, sacrilege, and tragic death. This narrative became a cornerstone of Christian folklore, and the superstition that it was bad luck for 13 people to dine together took hold across Europe. It was believed that if 13 people sat at a table, one of them was destined to die within the year. This belief was so strong that it even gave rise to a profession in 19th century Paris, the quatorzième, or the 14th, a professional guest who could be hired to join a dinner party of 13 to bring the number up to a safer 14. But the Christian tradition is not the only source for the number's sinister reputation. In Norse mythology, there is a similar tale of a dinner party gone wrong. The story tells of a great banquet held in Valhalla for 12 of the Norse gods. The trickster god, Loki, who had not been invited, crashed the party, becoming the 13th guest. His disruptive presence led to a conflict in which Balder, the god of light and beauty, was accidentally killed. Again, the arrival of a 13th member at a gathering brings chaos and death. This parallel between the Christian and Norse myths, though they come from different religious systems, reinforced the idea that 13 was an inherently disruptive and unlucky number. Over the centuries, this belief seeped into the very fabric of Western culture. Even today, many modern buildings will skip the 13th floor, with elevator buttons going directly from 12 to 14. Many airlines will not have a 13th row, and some hospitals avoid numbering rooms with 13. The number has become a symbol of bad luck so potent that it is actively engineered out of our modern environment. Now let's turn to the second component of this superstition: the day of the week. Friday on its own has a long and complicated history of being considered an inauspicious or unlucky day, particularly within the Christian world. Its negative reputation is primarily tied to the most solemn event in the Christian calendar, the Passion of Christ. According to the Gospels, Friday was the day that Jesus was crucified on Calvary. It was a day of immense suffering, betrayal, and the death of God's own Son. As a result, for centuries in Christian Europe, Friday was observed as a day of penance and sobriety. It was considered an unlucky day to begin a new journey, to start a new business venture, or to get married. To do so was seen as tempting fate, as showing a lack of respect for the solemnity of the day. Some old folklore even claimed that Adam and Eve were tempted by the serpent and expelled from the Garden of Eden on a Friday, and that the Great Flood began on a Friday, further cementing the day's association with disaster and divine punishment. However, the stigma attached to Friday may have even older pre-Christian roots. In many pagan traditions, Friday was not an unlucky day at all. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The name Friday in English comes from the Old English Frigedag, meaning the day of Frigg or Freya. Freya was one of the most powerful deities in the Norse pantheon, a goddess associated with love, beauty, fertility, and a form of magic known as seeder. She was a powerful and revered female figure. Similarly, in the Roman world, the day was Dies Veneris, the day of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. Friday, in these pagan systems, was a day of feminine power and sacred sensuality. Some historians and folklorists have argued that as Christianity spread across Europe and sought to supplant the older pagan beliefs, it engaged in a form of cultural and religious propaganda. One effective way to discredit the old gods was to demonize their sacred days. By associating Friday, the day of the great goddess, with the death of Christ and other disasters, the new religion could effectively transform a day of power into a day of fear. In this view, the unluckiness of Friday is not just a matter of Christian history, but a lingering echo of a much older religious conflict, a successful campaign to override a day of female divinity with a narrative of sorrow and bad fortune. So we have two separate and distinct streams of superstition, both with deep roots in Western culture: a fear of the number 13 and a fear of the day Friday. For centuries, these two beliefs flowed through history on parallel tracks. A person in the 17th or 18th century might have been wary of having 13 guests for dinner, and they might have avoided starting a new project on a Friday, but there is very little historical evidence to suggest that they were particularly afraid of the specific combination of Friday the 13th. The joining of these two superstitions into the single potent phobia we know today is a surprisingly recent phenomenon. Most folklorists and historians agree that the concept of Friday the 13th as a uniquely unlucky day did not become widespread until the late 19th or, more likely, the early 20th century. So what happened to fuse these two ancient fears together into a modern cultural obsession? The answer seems to lie in the power of popular culture and the media. While there are a few scattered references to the date being unlucky in the 1800s, the event that truly seems to have launched the superstition into the public consciousness was the publication of a novel in 1907. The book was titled Friday the 13th, and it was written by an eccentric American stockbroker named Thomas W. Lawson. The novel tells the story of a ruthless Wall Street financier who deliberately engineers a massive stock market crash on Friday the 13th, exploiting the underlying superstitions of other brokers to create a panic and make a fortune. The book was a bestseller. It was a thrilling and timely story that tapped into the anxieties of a rapidly industrializing and financially volatile world. It took the two separate vague superstitions and combined them into a single, dramatic, and memorable narrative. For the first time, Friday the 13th was presented to a mass audience as a day of specific and catastrophic financial doom. The seeds planted by Lawson's novel were watered by the growing power of 20th century media. Newspapers began to run stories about the superstition, often highlighting strange accidents or unfortunate events that happened to occur on that date. The more the media talked about the superstition, the more people became aware of it, and the more they began to notice and attribute bad luck to the classic case of confirmation bias. But the superstition was truly cemented into the bedrock of modern culture by the arrival of the horror movie industry. In 1980, the release of the slasher film Friday the 13th, featuring the iconic, hockey mask-wearing villain Jason Voorhees, transformed the date from a day of vague unease into a day of visceral terror. The film was a massive commercial success and spawned a huge franchise with numerous sequels, comic books, and merchandise. For a whole new generation, the date was no longer associated with stock market crashes or ancient folklore. It was associated with a relentless, unstoppable killer. Pop culture had successfully taken two old, disparate folk beliefs, merged them into a single concept, and then amplified that concept into a global phenomenon. This is the conventional, documented history of the Friday the 13th superstition. It is a story of separate ancient beliefs being fused together by modern popular culture. But there is another, far more intriguing and mysterious theory. This theory suggests that the pop culture phenomenon of the 20th century was not a new invention, but the final public emergence of a much older, more secret tradition. It proposes that the fear of Friday the 13th is not just a random combination of unlucky elements, but that it originates from a specific, traumatic, and bloody historical event that occurred on that very date more than 700 years ago. This theory argues that the superstition is not just a story about Judas and Loki, but a story rooted in the real-world betrayal and destruction of one of the most powerful and mysterious organizations the world has ever known, the Knights Templar. To explore this theory, we must leave the world of modern folklore and travel back to the dawn of the 14th century, to a fateful Friday the 13th that would forever live in infamy. To understand the theory that links our modern fear of Friday the 13th to a specific historical event, we must travel back in time, away from the world of modern superstition and into the heart of medieval Europe. We must turn our attention to one of the most powerful, wealthy, and enigmatic organizations the world has ever known, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known to history as the Knights Templar. Their story is a dramatic saga of faith, wealth, and power, a journey that took them from humble beginnings as pious warrior monks to the heights of international influence, only to end in a sudden, brutal, and shocking act of betrayal. And at the very center of that betrayal lies the infamous date that is the subject of our investigation. The story of the Templars' downfall is not just a historical footnote. It is a dark and compelling narrative that may hold the true, bloody origins of a superstition that haunts us to this day. The rise of the Knights Templar is one of the most remarkable stories of the medieval period. The order was founded in the early 12th century, around the year 1119, in the chaotic aftermath of the First Crusade. A small group of French knights, led by a nobleman named Hugues de Payens, approached Baldwin II, the king of Jerusalem, with a humble and pious proposal. The Crusades had successfully captured the Holy City, but the roads leading to it were still incredibly dangerous, plagued by bandits and raiders who preyed upon the thousands of Christian pilgrims flocking to the holy sites. These 9 knights took a vow to dedicate their lives to protecting these pilgrims, to serve as a kind of monastic police force. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience just like monks, but they did not trade their swords for prayer books. They were a new and revolutionary concept, the warrior monk. King Baldwin granted them a headquarters in a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, which was believed to be the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. It was from this sacred location that they took their name, the Knights of the Temple, or the Templars. For the first decade of their existence, the order remained small and relatively obscure, just 9 knights struggling to fulfill their noble but difficult mission. But their fortunes changed dramatically in 1129 at the Council of Troyes. There, thanks to the powerful advocacy of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the era, the Knights Templar were officially recognized by the Pope. They were given their own rule or code of conduct, and were granted a series of papal bulls that placed them outside the jurisdiction of all local kings and bishops. They answered to no one on earth except the Pope himself. This was a game-changing development. With the official backing of the Church, donations began to pour in from across Christendom. Wealthy nobles, eager to contribute to the defense of the Holy Land, gifted the order vast tracts of land, castles, farms, and huge sums of money. Young men from noble families, fired with religious zeal, flocked to join their ranks. Over the next 2 centuries, the Templars grew from a small band of 9 knights into a massive multinational corporation, the most powerful and influential organization of its time. They became the elite fighting force of the Crusader states, renowned for their discipline, their courage, and their fanatical devotion in battle. But their military prowess was only one part of their power. Their greatest and most lasting innovation was in the field of finance. Because their network of commanderies or preceptories stretched across Europe and the Holy Land, they were perfectly positioned to create what was, in effect, the world's first international banking system. A pilgrim or a noble traveling to the Holy Land no longer needed to carry vast, heavy, and easily stolen sums of gold and silver with them. Instead, they could deposit their funds at a Templar preceptory in London or Paris. They would receive a coded letter of credit, which they could then present at the Templar preceptory in Jerusalem or Acre to withdraw the equivalent amount. It was a revolutionary system of wire transfers that was centuries ahead of its time. Through this system, and through their vast landholdings and shrewd investments, the Templars accumulated an astonishing amount of wealth. They became the bankers to the kings and popes of Europe. They loaned huge sums of money to finance wars and state projects. They managed estates, collected taxes, and safeguarded treasures. They owned a massive fleet of ships, entire islands like Cyprus, and a network of castles and farms that made them a major economic power in every country in which they operated. They were, in short, too big to fail. Their white mantles, emblazoned with the distinctive red cross, became a symbol not just of piety and military valor, but of immense wealth, trust, and untouchable power. They were a state within a state, a sovereign entity with its own army, its own laws, and its own vast treasury, all protected by the ultimate authority of the Pope. For nearly 200 years, their position seemed unassailable. But in the corridors of power, their incredible success had bred a dangerous combination of jealousy, suspicion, and greed. By the beginning of the 14th century, the political landscape had changed. The Crusader states in the Holy Land had fallen, and the Templars had been forced to relocate their headquarters to Cyprus and then to France. Their original mission to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land was now largely obsolete, leading many to question their purpose and their continued existence. The order was still immensely wealthy and powerful, but without a clear military role, they became a target. And their most dangerous enemy was not a foreign sultan, but a Christian king, Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Philip was a ruthless, ambitious, and deeply cynical monarch. He was also chronically short of money. He had waged a series of expensive wars against England and Flanders that had left the French crown deeply, catastrophically in debt. And one of his biggest creditors was the Knights Templar. Philip looked upon the vast, untaxed wealth of the Templar order, which was headquartered in its magnificent fortress in Paris, not with respect but with covetous greed. He saw their power and their independence from his royal authority as a direct threat. He had already moved against the Lombard bankers and the Jews of France, expelling them and confiscating their assets to fill his empty coffers. Now he set his sights on a much bigger prize. He devised a secret, audacious, and utterly ruthless plan to destroy the most powerful order in Christendom and to seize their legendary treasure for himself. To achieve this, he needed a powerful ally, and he found one in the newly elected Pope Clement V. Clement was a Frenchman who was heavily indebted to Philip for his election, and he had moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon in southern France, a move that placed him firmly under the thumb of the French king. Philip began a campaign of whispers and accusations against the Templars. He claimed that he had heard dark rumors about their secret initiation ceremonies. He planted spies within the order, and he coerced disgruntled or expelled former Templars to provide false testimony. A series of shocking but completely fabricated charges were drawn up. The Templars, it was claimed, were not pious Christians at all. They were heretics. They were devil worshippers who spat on the cross, who denied Christ, who engaged in obscene homosexual rituals, and who secretly worshipped a mysterious bearded head known as Baphomet. The charges were absurd. A laundry list of the standard accusations that the medieval Inquisition used against any group it wished to destroy. But in a climate of suspicion and fear, they were enough. With the reluctant and cowed agreement of Pope Clement, Philip set his plan in motion. He acted with the deadly precision of a snake. He drafted secret orders, which were sealed and dispatched to his royal agents, or senecals, in every district throughout the Kingdom of France. The orders were to be opened and acted upon at the exact same time, to ensure that the Templars would have no chance to communicate with each other or to organize a defense. The chosen date for this coordinated, nationwide police action was Friday, October 13, 1307. At dawn on that fateful Friday morning, the trap was sprung. Across France, in a shocking and unprecedented move, the king's men stormed every Templar preceptory, castle, and farm. They smashed down doors and dragged the knights from their beds. The Templars, who were among the most feared warriors in the world, were caught completely by surprise. They were monks, and their rule forbade them from raising their swords against fellow Christians. They did not resist. Thousands of knights, sergeants, and chaplains were arrested in a single morning, including the aging Grand Master of the Order, a distinguished veteran of the Crusades named Jacques de Molay, who was arrested in the Paris Temple itself. The powerful order, which had stood for 2 centuries, was effectively decapitated and imprisoned in a matter of hours. The date Friday the 13th was forever seared into the institutional memory of the Templars and their sympathizers as a day of infamous betrayal, a day of disaster. What followed the arrests was one of the most shameful episodes in medieval history. The arrested knights, who had dedicated their lives to the defense of the Church, were handed over to the king's agents and the Dominican inquisitors to be questioned. This questioning was, in reality, brutal and systematic torture. The knights were subjected to the horrific techniques of the Inquisition. They were starved, they were deprived of sleep, and they were subjected to the rack, a device that stretched their limbs until their joints dislocated. Their feet were coated in animal fat and held over a fire until the flesh was burned away and the bones were exposed. They were subjected to strappado, where their hands were tied behind their backs and they were repeatedly hoisted into the air and then dropped, dislocating their shoulders. Under this unimaginable agony, human endurance has its limits. Many of the knights died during the torture, and most of them, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay himself, eventually broke. They confessed. They confessed to anything and everything their torturers wanted to hear. They confessed to spitting on the cross, to denying Christ, to worshipping idols, and to all the other fabricated charges. These forced confessions, extracted under the most extreme duress, were then triumphantly presented by King Philip as proof of the order's guilt. He used them to pressure the weak-willed Pope Clement into officially sanctioning the persecution. Although Templars in other countries like England and Spain were also arrested, The torture was rarely as severe, and most of them were eventually acquitted. But in France, the heartland of the order, the machine of the Inquisition, driven by the king's greed, was relentless. The vast wealth of the Templars was seized by the crown. Their lands, their farms, their castles all were confiscated. The Order of the Knights Templar, once the most powerful institution in Europe, was systematically and brutally dismantled. The betrayal that began on Friday, October 13, 1307, had culminated in the complete destruction of the order. But the story was not quite over. There was one final dramatic act to be played out, an act that would give birth to a powerful and enduring legend, the curse of the last Grand Master. The dawn raid of Friday, October 13, 1307, marked the beginning of the end for the Knights Templar. The years that followed were a dark and agonizing period of imprisonment, torture, and show trials, a meticulously orchestrated campaign by King Philip the Fair to legitimize his brutal seizure of the order's power and wealth. The forced confessions, extracted under the unimaginable pain of the Inquisition's methods, had served their purpose. They had blackened the name of the once proud order, and had given the reluctant Pope Clement V the political cover he needed to formally dissolve the Knights Templar in 1312. For all intents and purposes, the king had won. The Templars were broken, their assets confiscated, their members scattered or imprisoned. All that remained was to tie up the final loose ends, to deal with the aging leadership of the order who still languished in the king's dungeons. It was this final act, this public denouement, that would transform the story from a sordid tale of political greed into a powerful and enduring legend of supernatural retribution, a legend centered on the final defiant words of the last Grand Master. For 7 long, grueling years, Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, had endured the horrors of imprisonment. He was an old man, likely in his late 60s, a veteran of the brutal wars in the Holy Land, a man who had commanded armies and advised kings. Now he was a frail and broken prisoner, his body weakened by years of confinement in a dark, damp cell, and scarred by the tortures he had been forced to endure. Under this immense pressure, he, like so many of his brethren, had confessed to the fabricated charges against the order. It was a confession born of agony, not of guilt, a desperate attempt to make the pain stop. He had been promised leniency, perhaps a quiet retirement in a monastery, if he cooperated. And so, he had played his part in the king's grim theater. But as he languished in prison, waiting for his final sentence, something within him seems to have hardened. Perhaps it was a resurgence of his old warrior's pride, a deep sense of shame at having betrayed the honor of his order, or a final desperate desire to set the historical record straight. He was about to be given one last public stage, and he decided to use it not for a plea for mercy, but for a final earth-shattering act of defiance. The stage was set on March 18, 1314. A massive scaffold had been erected in the square in front of the great cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. A huge crowd had gathered, a mix of commoners, clergy, and nobles, all eager to witness the final chapter in the great Templar saga. 3 cardinal legates, representatives of the Pope, were there to deliver the final judgment. Jacques de Molay, along with 3 other high-ranking Templar dignitaries, Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, Hugues de Perraud, visitor of France, and Godefroy de Gonneville, preceptor of Aquitaine, were brought out from their dungeons and led onto the scaffold. They were a pathetic sight, old and gaunt, their white Templar mantles now little more than dirty rags. The charges against them were read out, a long and lurid list of heresy and blasphemy, and then the sentence was pronounced. In light of their full confessions, they were to be shown a degree of mercy. They were sentenced to spend the rest of their natural lives in prison, a sentence of perpetual incarceration. This was meant to be the end of it. The crowd would witness the humbled leaders being led away, the authority of the king and the church would be affirmed, and the Templar affair would be officially closed. But at that moment, as the sentence was read, something unexpected happened. Jacques de Molay, the old and broken Grand Master, found a final reserve of strength. He raised his head, his eyes scanning the crowd, and in a loud, clear voice that stunned the assembled dignitaries, he did the unthinkable. He recanted his confession. He proclaimed to the world that his confession, and those of his brother knights, had been lies, extracted from them only through the agony of torture. He declared that the Order of the Knights Templar was holy, just, and innocent of all the vile charges laid against it. He stated that he was guilty only of one thing, of the sin of betraying his order to save his own miserable life. He announced that he was ready to die a martyr's death to atone for that weakness, rather than live in shame with the stain of a lie upon his soul. Geoffroy de Charny, standing beside him, immediately joined his Grand Master, also loudly proclaiming the order's innocence. The crowd was thrown into turmoil. The cardinals were stunned into silence. The carefully orchestrated public relations event had just exploded into a spectacular act of public defiance. King Philip the Fair, who was present at the scene, was consumed with a cold, swift fury. This was a direct challenge to his authority, a public humiliation that he could not tolerate. De Molay and de Charny, by recanting their confessions, were now considered relapsed heretics by the merciless logic of the Inquisition, and the penalty for a relapsed heretic was immediate death, without any further trial. The king did not hesitate. Bypassing the authority of the papal legates, he made a decision on the spot. He ordered that the two defiant Templars be taken and burned at the stake that very same evening. The other two leaders, who had remained silent and had not recanted, were led back to prison to live out their sentences. But for Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny, their final terrible fate was sealed. As dusk began to fall over Paris, the king's men hastily constructed a pyre on a small island in the middle of the river Seine, the Île aux Juifs, which is now part of the Pont Neuf. This location was deliberately chosen. It was in full view of the royal palace gardens, allowing the king and his court to watch the execution. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny were brought to the island and tied to the stakes. The pyre was lit. The crowd that had gathered on the banks of the river watched in a mixture of horror and awe as the flames began to lick at the dry wood, rising higher and higher, engulfing the two old knights. And it was here, in this final agonizing moment, surrounded by fire and smoke, that the legend of the Templars' curse was born. According to the chronicles of the time and the enduring folklore that followed, Jacques de Molay did not scream or cry out in pain as the fire consumed him. Instead, he faced his death with an unnerving calm and a final terrible purpose. As the flames roared around him, he raised his voice one last time, not to plead for his life, but to issue a prophecy, a solemn and terrifying summons from the heart of the fire. The most famous account of this event comes from the French chronicler Geoffroy de Paris, who was an eyewitness to the execution and recorded it in his rhyming chronicle. He, and later traditions, report that de Molay directed his final words to the two men he held most responsible for the destruction of his order, the man who sat on the throne of France, and the man who sat on the throne of St. Peter. From the flames, the dying Grand Master supposedly cried out, his voice ringing with an eerie prophetic authority. He declared that God knew they were innocent, and that a great calamity would soon befall those who had unjustly condemned them. He then issued his specific and chilling summons. He called upon Pope Clement V, the pope who had betrayed the order and sanctioned its destruction, to meet him before the judgment seat of God within 40 days. And he called upon King Philip the Fair, the architect of his ruin, the man whose greed and ambition had driven the entire affair, to meet him before that same divine tribunal within the year. He had, in effect, cursed them. He had declared that their earthly power would not save them, and that they would soon be forced to answer for their crimes in the highest court of all. The legend goes further, claiming he cursed not just the king, but his entire lineage and the kingdom of France itself for 13 generations. It was a final desperate act of vengeance, the only weapon a powerless dying man had left. For the crowd watching on the riverbanks, these were shocking and unforgettable words. For King Philip and Pope Clement, they were likely dismissed as the delusional rantings of a dying heretic. But what happened next would transform de Molay's final words from a desperate outburst into a prophecy of terrifying accuracy. The Grand Master's curse, it seemed, began to come true with a chilling and undeniable precision. The first to fall was Pope Clement V. Just over 1 month after de Molay's execution, in April of 1314, the Pope, who had been suffering from a stomach ailment, died a painful death. His end was ignominious. During the lying-in state, a thunderstorm caused a bolt of lightning to strike the church where his body was laid out, starting a fire that partially consumed his corpse before it could be buried. For the superstitious populace of Europe, the connection was immediate and obvious. The Pope had been called to God's judgment by the martyred Grand Master, and God had answered. The first part of the curse had been fulfilled. All eyes then turned to the second, and more powerful target of the curse, King Philip the Fair. Philip was at the height of his power. He was a strong, healthy man in his mid-40s. He had successfully crushed the most powerful order in Christendom, filled his treasury with their wealth, and solidified his absolute authority over both the church and the state in France. He seemed untouchable, but the curse hung over him. The summer passed and then the autumn. And then in November of 1314, just 8 months after de Molay's execution, disaster struck. While out on a royal hunt, the king suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, or a stroke. He fell from his horse and was carried back to his palace, paralyzed and unable to speak. He lingered for a few weeks, his powerful body failing him, and then he died. The seemingly invincible king was dead, well within the 1-year time limit that de Molay had pronounced from the flames. The fulfillment of the curse was now complete, and its effect on the European imagination was profound. It was a stunning and terrifying confirmation of the Templars' innocence and the guilt of their persecutors. The story of the curse spread like wildfire across the continent, repeated by troubadours in song and chroniclers in their histories. It became a powerful piece of anti-royal and anti-papal propaganda. The legend was further cemented by the subsequent misfortunes of Philip's family. His 3 sons would all rule as king in succession, but they would all die young, without producing a male heir to continue the direct Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 300 years. This curse of the Capetians would plunge France into a succession crisis that would eventually lead to the devastating 100 Years' War with England. To many, this was simply the long-term fulfillment of de Molay's curse upon the Kingdom of France. The story of the Grand Master's curse became one of the great enduring legends of the Middle Ages. It was a powerful narrative of divine retribution, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the abuse of power. It transformed Jacques de Molay from a failed leader into a holy martyr, and it forever stained the reputations of King Philip and Pope Clement. The dramatic events of that evening in Paris in 1314, with the old knight issuing his final fiery prophecy, created a powerful and lasting cultural memory. But did it also create the superstition of Friday the 13th? This is the central question. The theory proposes that the memory of the original infamous day of betrayal, Friday, October 13, 1307, was now inextricably linked in the popular mind with the dramatic and seemingly supernatural fulfillment of the curse. The date was no longer just a day of bad luck. It was a day of doom, a day marked by holy blood and a powerful curse, a day whose evil omen had been proven by the deaths of a pope and a king. The stage was now set for this powerful historical legend to merge with the older, more general superstitions about the day and the number, creating the single potent phobia that we know today. We have now arrived at the very heart of our mystery. We have dissected the anatomy of the modern Friday the 13th superstition, seeing how it was formed from 2 separate, ancient streams of fear, a suspicion of the number 13, and a stigma attached to the day Friday. And we have journeyed back in time to witness the dramatic and tragic history of the Knights Templar, culminating in their betrayal on Friday, October 13, 1307, and the powerful, seemingly fulfilled curse of their last Grand Master. The two stories are compelling on their own, but the final crucial question is, are they connected? Is the modern widespread fear of Friday the 13th a direct, albeit long forgotten, descendant of the trauma inflicted upon the Templars? Or is this connection a modern invention, a compelling piece of historical fiction created centuries later to give a simple superstition a more dramatic and romantic origin story? This is where history, folklore, and conspiracy converge, in the fascinating process of how a powerful historical memory can transform into a modern legend. The central puzzle for historians and folklorists is the long period of silence. As we've seen, the fear of the number 13 and the unluckiness of Friday existed for centuries. The story of the Templars' destruction and Jacques de Molay's curse also became a famous and enduring legend throughout the late Middle Ages. However, for nearly 500 years, there is a conspicuous lack of direct, explicit historical evidence linking the specific date of Friday the 13th to a general sense of bad luck in the popular consciousness. We do not find widespread mentions in letters, diaries, or official documents from the 15th, 16th, or 17th centuries of people actively avoiding this date or considering it cursed. This has led many mainstream academics to conclude that the Templar theory is simply a modern myth, a retrofitting of a good story onto an existing superstition. In this view, 19th and 20th century authors, fascinated by the romantic and mysterious history of the Templars, discovered the coincidence that their downfall began on a Friday the 13th. They then seized upon this dramatic historical event and presented it as the true origin of the superstition, a story far more compelling than the vague folklore about the Last Supper. This is a plausible and logical argument, but it may not be the whole story. The lack of widespread written evidence does not necessarily mean that a belief did not exist. For centuries, the vast majority of the population was illiterate. Their beliefs, their stories, and their superstitions were not preserved in written texts, but in the fluid and powerful medium of oral tradition. It is entirely possible that the story of the Templars' doom on that specific date was kept alive as a folk memory, a cautionary tale passed down from generation to generation. It may not have been a universal, crippling fear as it is today, but a more localized or niche belief, a piece of folklore that warned of the dangers of unchecked power and the treachery of kings, with the date itself serving as a powerful mnemonic device, a shorthand for the entire tragic story. The memory of the curse, which seemed so miraculously fulfilled, would have given the story an extra layer of supernatural dread, ensuring its survival in the popular imagination, even if it rarely appeared in the official histories written by the educated elite. This idea of a hidden underground tradition is given significant weight when we consider the role of secret societies and esoteric groups in preserving and popularizing the Templar legend. Following their official dissolution in 1312, the Knights Templar ceased to exist as a formal organization, but their sudden and mysterious disappearance, combined with the legends of their vast hidden treasure and their supposed secret knowledge, made them a subject of endless fascination. In the 18th century, during a great flourishing of esoteric thought and fraternal organizations, a new movement arose, Neo-Templarism. Groups like the Freemasons, particularly certain higher rites like the Scottish Rite and the Knights Templar degree within the York Rite, began to incorporate Templar history, symbolism, and ritual into their own belief systems. For these groups, the Knights Templar were not seen as heretics, but as enlightened martyrs, the keepers of a secret wisdom who were unjustly persecuted by a tyrannical king and a corrupt church. In the mythology of these secret societies, the story of Jacques de Molay's defiance and curse is a central and foundational event. For them, Friday, October 13th, is not a day of generic bad luck. It is a solemn and significant anniversary. It is a day of martyrdom, a day to remember the betrayal and to honor the memory of the fallen Grand Master. Within the secret ritualized world of these organizations, the date took on a profound and enduring significance. It was through the extensive writings and influence of these 18th and 19th century Freemasons and Neo-Templars that the story of the Templars and the significance of Friday the 13th was brought back into the wider cultural conversation. They were the ones who kept the legend alive, who studied the history, and who first began to popularize the idea that this specific date had a deep, historical and esoteric meaning. So, while the general public may not have been aware of the connection, it was being actively preserved and cultivated within these influential secret societies for centuries. The stage was now set for the final act in the creation of our modern legend. The groundwork had been laid by the ancient, separate fears of the number and the day. The historical narrative had been provided by the dramatic fall of the Templars, and the legend had been kept alive and nurtured for centuries within esoteric circles. All that was needed was a catalyst to bring this story out of the secretive world of the lodge room and into the full glare of popular culture. That catalyst arrived in the 20th and 21st centuries with the explosion of mass media and a renewed public fascination with historical conspiracies and lost secrets. The so-called Dan Brown effect cannot be overstated in this context. While many authors and historians had written about the Templars before, Dan Brown's 2003 novel The Da Vinci Code became one of the best-selling books of all time, read by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Although the book's plot is a work of fiction, it is built upon a foundation of real historical mysteries, and the Knights Templar are central to its narrative. Brown masterfully wove together the history of the Templars, the search for the Holy Grail, and various conspiracy theories into a single, incredibly compelling thriller. He specifically highlighted the story of the Templars' arrest on Friday the 13th, presenting it to a massive global audience as a pivotal event in a secret history. For millions of readers, this was the first time they had ever heard this story, and the connection seemed undeniable. The novel and the subsequent blockbuster film acted as a cultural tipping point, firmly embedding the idea of the Templars' curse as the true origin of the Friday the 13th superstition in the public consciousness. What was once a topic of interest for historians and members of esoteric orders was now common knowledge, a piece of pop culture trivia that everyone knew. This has been reinforced by countless television documentaries, History Channel specials, video games like the Assassin's Creed series, and a whole genre of historical fiction that continues to mine the rich vein of Templar mythology. The link between the Templars' doom and the unlucky date is now so well established in the popular mind that it is often presented as undisputed historical fact, even though the direct, unbroken line of evidence remains elusive. So, what can we conclude from this complex and fascinating journey? Is the connection between the Templars and Friday the 13th real, or is it a modern invention? The most likely answer is that it is a bit of both. It is a powerful cultural memory that has been shaped, preserved, and amplified over time. The historical event is undeniably real. A powerful, respected order was indeed betrayed and arrested on Friday, October 13, 1307. The legend is also real. The story of Jacques de Molay's curse and its seemingly miraculous fulfillment became a potent and enduring piece of European folklore. It is highly probable that this powerful story survived for centuries as an oral tradition, a folk memory associating that specific date with betrayal and doom, especially within circles that were sympathetic to the Templars or suspicious of royal and papal authority. This underground stream of folklore was then channeled and preserved by the secret societies of the 18th and 19th centuries, who saw themselves as the spiritual heirs of the Templars. And finally, in the 20th and 21st centuries, this esoteric tradition was seized upon by popular culture, which amplified it and broadcast it to a global audience, cementing it as the definitive origin story. The modern superstition is therefore not a direct, unchanged survival from the 14th century, nor is it a complete fabrication. It is the product of a long and complex process of cultural evolution, Ultimately, whether the historical link is direct and unbroken or not is almost beside the point. The story of the Knights Templar provides something that no other origin theory can: a powerful and deeply human narrative. It transforms a vague and abstract superstition into a legend rooted in a real, verifiable historical event. The fear of Friday the 13th is no longer just about a clumsy number or an unlucky day of the week. It becomes a dark anniversary, a cultural memory of a day of profound injustice, a day when a powerful and pious order was brought down by the deadly sins of greed and political ambition. It is a story of betrayal, of torture, of stolen treasure, and of a dying man's curse that seemingly came true. And that is a story far more compelling, far more memorable, and far more terrifying than simple bad luck. It is a reminder that sometimes our most persistent modern fears have deep, dark, and very bloody historical roots. While scholars debate the direct historical link, the story of the Knights Templar provides the most powerful explanation for our fear of Friday the 13th. It transforms a simple superstition into a dark anniversary, a cultural memory of a day when a powerful order was brought down by greed and betrayal. It's a reminder that sometimes our modern fears have deep and bloody historical roots. If the past still whispers to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Ancient Relics Keeper, because some mysteries were never meant to be buried.